Hello, and welcome to this very special episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine, and as usual, I am joined by Toni Tresca.
Hey there.
But I'm so excited and delighted to have yet another interview, yay,
Yay.
But with the one and only Dani Bethea. Dani, you are the former editor-in-chief of the We Are Horror magazine. You have been on panels and podcasts and publications, including Medium Publications, Cinespeak, Gaily Dreadful, Uppercut Crit, and so many more. And you're going to be a featured cast member in a mental health and horror documentary, which is fantastic. Oh, thank you for joining us today.
Wow. The rattling of the resume, it kind of just like, well, thank you all truly for having me on and just like for deigning my voice to be like important enough to even feature. It's just always just very humbling. It's still kind of, I don't know, I have to kind of exhale sometimes because it's just like, oh, who, me?
Yeah.
So thank you both so much, Toni, Katie. It's really an honor.
It's an honor for us too to get to just sit down and talk with someone as prolific as you. Your work is absolutely fantastic. You've written on so many number of subjects. And I think one of my favorite things about reading your work was just how much you own who you are within your own work itself. Dr. Troyer and I were talking about that right before we got on, like how in your work you're clearly explicit within the analysis, like that you are Black and queer and you are writing these things because they're important to you. And I just loved seeing that within your work. So I'm so excited to be talking to you today.
And that's actually one of the things that I want to see horror scholarship start doing more of. You know, I think all of us were taught at some point in school, like, who cares about the first person? You know, no one cares about you, take you out. And while I still maintain that you don't always need a sentence that says I argue, because you could just have the argument, like there's something really wrong about that. And reading your work and hearing you be like, hey, burnout is real. Let me tell you how burnout led me to where I am. Or as a Black woman watching this, let me tell you what my thoughts are about Candyman and its portrayal of Black women. That's what we should be doing, right? It's the correction that the academia needs to be taking if we're going to go where we need to go. So I'm so excited to get to like dive into your brain a little bit.
Thank you. It's like that scene in Dr. Sleep, right? Where we were going in Abra's, filing cabinets.
Yes. And just be like, yes, hopefully you won't slam the filing cabinet shut on us when we find the juicy bits. But if you do, it's completely understandable.
No, I won't throw you out like Abra.
Such a good movie.
That is much appreciated. So
Toni, you have the first question.
We're going to kick it off pretty easy, straightforward with the question that we ask everyone who comes on here, because it's a great way to lead into the larger conversation of horror. So what is a horror text that you have read or watched in the last year that moved you?
Ooh, okay. So for a recent podcast, I don't think I can speak on what it is yet. I watched La Llorona by Jairo Bustamante, and it was fantastic. It was a beautiful horror history text. Like, I'm a huge fan of those. So like, ding, it like checked the box of being like this great integration of horror and history. I mean, it had this ghost story element. It completely kind of expanded my purview and my knowledge even further. So I love when directors and scholars and people who make horror can make things like Guillermo del Toro's like The Devil's Backbone or Pan's Labyrinth that explore like war or conflicts or gender or just all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm a huge fan of that. So La Llorona was like a delight for this year. I'm still trying to catch up from like all of the cavalcade of 2021 because there was so much stuff put on streaming. So I'm a little overwhelmed. Like, I've got a little post-it note like list of stuff.
That's awesome
to catch up on. So I'm working on.
And they make it hard. They're all on different streaming platforms that you got to get onto. Oh yeah. So much good horror. What was the historical setting of that one? I haven't seen that horror film, so I've got a new one for me to catch up on. Where was La Llorona? What historical period did it take place in?
Well, La Llorona, the story recounts the atrocities that happened in the 1980s to the present in I'm trying to make sure I have my setting absolutely positively correct. Guatemala. So the Guatemalan genocides, which are very deep and interesting because it was not just the United States being embroiled in this conflict. It was Latin America, it was the United States. It was like a lot of global interests that were converging on Guatemala for produce, for land, for resources. And obviously, the most vulnerable people were the native and indigenous people of Guatemala. And it went into the background of the trials that held a lot of these warlords and people who were responsible to account. And what was really beautiful about it was it also had this element where folklore and the real world started to blur together. So the ghosts, quote unquote, of the atrocities, right, came back in first kind of spiritual form, and then obviously taking on a corporeal shape. I'm trying not to do any spoilers.
Yeah.
Much appreciated.
But obviously more and more of this tether, right, to the supernatural started to slip into the narrative that really delved into things like colonialism and genocide, and the fact that the ghosts of these people are not gone. The people are very still much alive and still fighting, for recognition, for autonomy, for land, for resources, for just being acknowledged as people and not being erased. So yeah, fantastic film.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah. That does sound really cool. I love all of the different issues that it taps into. I think that leads us into our next question,
which I always feel bad asking because I'm always afraid that like people are going to be like, "Are you keeping like a dossier on me?" But like, what scares you in real life? And then the more important, like the relevant part is, and how do these fears play into the horror text that you tend to write about?
I pondered this question. On a soft note, I despise spiders. So I am an arachnophobe to my core. So fake spiders, real spiders, doesn't matter. I kind of love and I hate the year I was born. I was born in 1990, and Arachnophobia had to come out the year I was born. It's one of my favorite movies to hate watch.
Yeah.
I completely feel you. I don't hate spiders as much as I hate scorpions, which are also arachnids. So because I lived in Arizona, and it was like they were everywhere, like in my trapper keeper, and I took it to school and it crawled out of my desk. Anyway, so
oh my gosh.
And that was like one of the gentler stories. So I'm 100% with you that like things that have too many legs and things that have no legs are off the list.
I was about to throw in, if you throw in snakes in here, scorpions, spiders, and snakes are my three big ones that I could not do. So I am with you. Not a fan of the spiders.
So there's your softcore one. What's your like deep one?
Oh, well, if we're talking about, if we're getting back on a serious note, what scares me horror wise is just what humanity is capable of, is that dark, like evil side of what humanity is capable of. So like whenever, we have kind of our hardcore horror films that explore, our slashers, right? We love our slashers, but at the same time, we know that like, oh shoot, like in real life, there were like slashers who were like killing people or killing children or killing women or, targeting queer people or, knowing that is real, right? So, I mean, that's the horror stuff that like keeps me up at night. And also, gosh darn it, I'm one of those people who's just like, I'll watch this documentary or or listen to this podcast about XYZ horrific event, because it's just like, it's still mind-blowing that like that's our reality, or that's a reality, the timeline that we're on, that we exist on that continuum of like really horrific stuff that actually exists and happened to people. And it's just, I don't know, that's the kind of horror stuff that it's just like I love and I loathe. So it's just like it's I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe. We're really interesting human beings. How horror movies can be a comfort watch because there's sometimes a little bit of distance you can put between yourself and the movie. It's not real. So that's why I can usually watch a horror movie like no problem, because it's not real, it's fake, it's like fake blood, it's a fake chainsaw, it's like a what I mean, it's a fake slasher, it's not a real Michael Myers or whatever, or since people are talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Leatherface running around, so I guess there's that element too. So that's a very good question.
I think that makes perfect sense though. And it's why, I will continue to advocate for including the genre in the classroom, because it allows us to take a deeper look into humanity through a lens that's sometimes more accessible, right? Because people can be like, oh, that would never happen. And then I'm like, but wait, let me tell you the story upon which this was founded. And then, there's always like, every time I read from Layla Taylor's Darkly and her section on Ruthie McCoy, every time I read that aloud, which I do every time I show Candyman, which I show on almost every class, I get chills, right? I still get cheers and chills, and I still have to like pause so that I don't start crying, because it's like this, right? Like we can watch this movie and be like, oh, but that wasn't scary, but it is scary in a fundamental way. So I think that's a fantastic answer.
Yeah. And dually so is like when you watch films and let's say like we were talking about films that have a historical context to them. So like watching Candyman, you can't, like if you can't unknow, right? Yeah. So when you're watching the film, if things are either wrong or absent or missing or just, those are things you pick up on, and it can sometimes kind of take you out of it a little bit if there's a really deep kind of historical or social component to it. That you obviously would be like, bing, that's not right. Or bing, why would you include Ruthie McCoy, but like not like you mentioned, why would you not explore like the horror that Black women are going through as well, and just kind of sidelining them? That's a great example, Dr. Troyer. That's a great example.
It's Katie. It's 100%. Tony's still trying to call me Katie. It's Katie.
Oh, okay. Katie.
No, I just like Tony said it, and I was like, Tony, no, you know better. But it's a hard habit to break. So Tony, I believe you have another question.
We're curious, how did you get into writing about genre filmmaking and horror as a journalist, cultural commentator, and just a scholar in general?
That is a fantastic question. So I would probably have to scroll maybe all the way back down and take a trip down memory lane on my Medium page to see when I started kind of writing what I wanted to write after I got out of graduate school. But I think one of the first pieces I wrote explored Blackness as other, or Blackness as alien. The piece in particular delved into how there are so many different like body snatching narratives that I had picked up on in my youth, where they would easily try to blend into white society, or jump into a white body, or easily don the cloak of like whiteness, and that being kind of just a through line in a lot of films I found. And I was just thinking about like, well, there's something very deep and kind of insidious about that like that Black people are disposable, absent, erased, not even worthy of being assimilated into by the alien, or the fact that the alien is actually very intelligent by knowing that like, Black people are a target, or Native people are a target, or it, like The Thing was another example that I was thinking about kind of intensely. Another film, right? The Thing, your different pod people, genre movies. I know there's been like a plethora of golly, what are those pod people? What are the pod people movies?
I feel like you've named the big ones, so now Invasion. I can't remember.
It was Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yes. I literally just said thank you both. That was like one of the first pieces I explored where I was just like, that's interesting. And it really, that was like probably the seed that, I'd always been thinking about horror in like these really layered ways, but that was an example where I could kind of write it out and kind of dissect a lot of my thoughts about, horror and its, missteps or lack of inclusion in certain areas. And then like where that, kind of narrative can be flipped on its head. So like in the piece later on, I wrote about, let's say like the skeleton key that had like a big rug pull for the audience that obviously showed the horror from like a white point of view, where Black people said, you know what, we need to assimilate, not necessarily assimilate, we need to don the cloak of whiteness ourselves so that we can get out of this situation alive, that actually like, went into voodoo and spirituality and body swapping and did all of this really interesting stuff and showed that that genre can be used in a very different way for Black people to survive or to escape or for freedom. It was just like, I was just thinking about different, films that start to flip a lot of our kind of narrative conventions on their head, or like are really playing with like gender, or trying to like excise masculinity in some really interesting ways. So like I think that was one of the first that was the catalyst for what was to come as far as my writing is concerned. And it's just kind of snowballed from here, and it's been like no stone left unturned. Like if you're a horror movie or a genre or even something that doesn't have a name yet, like I think you all have read some of my pieces where I try to put a name or put a pin in something that we know exists but haven't kind of put in our horror filing system yet. So
yes.
Yeah, so totally that.
What did you go to grad school for, if I can ask?
So I went to grad school for environmental policy and gender, women, and sexuality studies.
Okay.
So that's
very cool. So that's very diverse.
Yeah. And I met some incredibly diverse people throughout the course of my studies. Like what I loved about my program is that it gave me a lot of exposure to a lot of different classes. So it gave me options to take classes like in social work. It gave me options to take, classes in healthcare. It gave me options to take classes in like environmental studies, ethics, policy, like international, relations and stuff like that. Like I had some like fantastic teachers who were not from the United States. So obviously you get an even broader like lens of, the world that's going on with you, around you. I had some fellow students who were working on getting like their doula certification. Like, so like being in those dual programs really just, exposed me even more to kind of like a broader world that, when I really started writing, it really just kind of put the heat under me to make sure that every time like I write, I always keep in the back of my mind, like who's not included, right? Who's not being written about, who matters, whose story needs to be told, who have we like yet to kind of uplift, in the genre and everything else. So yeah, that was, as much as I literally kind of got wrecked from graduate school because I did school straight through, like no breaks. And that was a mistake.
Yeah.
That was a mistake. So, but at the same time, I kind of have no regrets because like that kind of chapter is closed and I was able to turn the page and start writing a new one. So.
And both of those degrees seem like really interesting lenses to then bring into horror studies more, or genre studies more broadly, because environmental issues, gender issues are two very popular things in modern horror nowadays to discuss and unpack. So it's very interesting that those two previous programs then now got you to hear in some tangible way, I guess.
What made you decide to start like writing stuff that other people would see, right? Like, I mean, I think that hurdle of getting started is exceptionally difficult. And I think about, I write in part because I feel like it's for my job, right? Or for my role in the university. So what made you say, like, I'm doing it and I'm gonna be an independent scholar in many respects, which can be a really hard path to navigate?
Well, honestly, kind of as mentioned, after graduate school, I really just kind of wanted to start to write what I wanted to write. Yeah. So I wanted to write like outside of the university for once. I wanted to start to write outside of that framework, but use some of those same really good detective skill type foundations to really unpack all of these different things, like as I mentioned previously. But honestly, I just kind of went at it alone. I just kind of did my research and found like, well, what's a good platform that I don't have to necessarily sink a whole bunch of money into? And Medium was kind of it at the time and kind of still is. I think it's pretty accessible, I think. I didn't want to kind of have a space that was really kind of gate kept or anything. I wanted it to be accessible. And then after that, like I kind of got picked up by a few publications here and there, something Ghoulish, which became Ghoulish Media, which is now no more. Rely on Horror Gaming. I got an opportunity to write with them for a good while. And really, it was just maybe just being sometimes at the right place at the right time and getting an opportunity to really kind of flex your skills, write, have editors to kind of critique and kind of, tool and retool, what you write, or just having the opportunity to really kind of get your hands messy, I guess, get your hands dirty and like really work on crafting your voice and your style. And I think that's key, that a lot of people really just kind of work at it. That eventually you'll get into a place where you have a rhythm and you have, I don't know, you just kind of have your flow, whatever that is, like down packed. But eventually somehow my work just really started to get eyes on it, like through Twitter. I know like one of my biggest kind of boosters was Ashley Blackwell. Like I probably will say until the point that I'm senile, that like Ashley Blackwell was like one of the first people who, because she is such a like person like in the horror space, in the horror and academia, space. And it was just surreal. Like I never would have thought, like after seeing the documentary Horror Noir, that really was just like, oh, I need to keep at this. Like I need to keep writing, like keep going, because, I just, just something about it would just like really lit a fire under me, because I was like, finally, this documentary is being made. It's finally, happening. And I know that behind the scenes just, and they've even actually, I've had some talk with some people who helped make it, that, it would not have been greenlit if Get Out wasn't a success. So literally, like if Get Out did not perform well, that Horror Noir would have like just been shelved, not been picked up by Shudder. Like just kind of not thought to be important enough to display to the masses. And now that horror noir exists, everybody talks about it. Like you can't not talk about horror as it exists, right, without talking about horror noir and all the people who help make the genre and, you know, blood, sweat, and tears into it, you know.
I think that's why I'm such a big fan of public humanities, is because the thing that's so delightful about the stuff that you're writing and about horror noir is that they're timely in a way that the normal academic publications can't be. You know, like normal academic publications are like, okay, in a couple of months this film's coming out, so we'll have a book done in 7 years. You know, and you're like and you're like, okay, well that's a thing, but you're like, hey, this thing is happening today, I'm writing about it today, but it's still, like you said, has that detective element to it, which
and
Toni,
I had a quick question. I was like, in so much coming out today, how do you decide which texts you are going to write something about versus which texts you maybe are like just enjoy or maybe not enjoy as much, and then not write about?
Sometimes it depends on, like, honestly, like I think any writer, their mood, their headspace. I try not to jump on the like, ooh, what's hot train. Everybody's writing about, you know, XYZ movie because it just came out. Like I'm like a good school of thought. What works for me a lot of times is to let a movie or a subject matter breathe and then wait. But then sometimes I watch some things that are like timely and urgent. So like I wrote about Lovecraft Country like as it was happening. And there were some things that were in that show that I was like, this is timely and urgent and I need to write about it now. I need to like get eyes on this now. And some of those things were the murder and erasure of Native and Indigenous like Two-Spirit like people, the homophobia that was in it, like the really problematic aspects of like colorism, bury your gaze that happened in it. Like there was some, I mean, as much as I wrote throughout the tenure of its very short-lived first season, that for all of the highs, there are also lows, and it's okay. It is absolutely perfectly okay to critique the show and like have it, you know, on a scale of like good and bad. Like it is a-okay. It's okay. Like to talk this stuff out is a-okay. And then the same thing with like Candyman when it came out, because I had just been waiting on it. It was the only film I went to go see like in the theater. So I was just like, you know what, double mask. Let's get our N95 on. Let's pick a day when I know no one is at the theater. And actually, ironically enough, there were a few people in the theater, but when I looked around, now this was very interesting. It was mainly like Black, Latino people in the audience. So I was just like, okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
It might have just been the time of day. Could have just been by happenstance, but the point was, I was like, okay, good. People want to see this.
Yeah.
But then sometimes I just write about stuff for giggles and like fun and like to kind of give a window into my world of nerdy stuff that I'm into. So the listeners can't see it, but like behind me, you probably see some of my I'm pointing in a weird way. Some of my shoes from like the Alien films. Like I'm still trying to get the high top Ripley shoes from the second film. So
that's cool.
They are currently $2,000.
Nope.
Whoa.
and I do not have $2,000.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a real life horror story right there. Oh my gosh.
Tell me about it. So even the fact that when the shoes first came out, speaking of horror, right? When the shoes first came out, they did not have them in quote unquote smaller women's sizes, AKA you would think that like, wait a minute, a woman
they're for Ripley. Yeah.
Right. So so they got flack for that when they first came out years ago, and then they're like, whoops, let's scramble and make a few smaller sizes because the internet exists and people flamed Reebok badly for it.
Good.
Yeah.
But yeah, like sometimes I just like, depends on my mood, depends on like what strikes me. Movies that I'm just like, wow, this is gonna be a movie that like lasts until like the end of time, and it's gonna be one of those that was like a pop cultural like game changer. Like we kind of alluded to, like Dr. Sleep. Like there was so much about Dr. Sleep that was one of the last films I was able to see before the pandemic. So like there's a lot of films that I'm just like, you know what, let's write about it. Let's see what I can explore in it that maybe someone has not written about before, or take it from an angle that is like the path like less trodden about it. So I try to do that because I really sometimes don't like reading horror pieces that's just like somebody else wrote what somebody else wrote, and it's like a copy and paste thing between some horror publications, and that's sometimes unescapable. But I love when people are just like, I'm going to write about this movie, but I'm also going to write about, let's say, me as a disabled person. This is how this character shows up for me. Or me as a pregnant woman. This is how, I don't know, Inside, the French, horror film like operates for me. Or like I mentioned, let's say, I don't know, La Llorona with like Yaro Bustamante. Like, how does this movie show up for me, like as a Latin American person? You know what I mean? So like taking elements of a lot of the horror films that we watch and then just really kind of delving into those unexplored, avenues, because for so long, I didn't really know until obviously the advent of the internet, like who was really writing about horror, who was really doing the analysis, quote unquote, who were the people who were put on or put in front of the camera or were considered like the experts. And it was just really like, oh, so it's like this everywhere. Okay, got you. It's not just academia. It's not just like on the news. It's not just in the gaming spaces. It's not just in the nerd circles. I'm like, okay, this is everywhere. So I was like, okay, we got to change this.
And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about your writing is that you're advocating for change, but you're also enjoying it. I think that that's a hard line, right? Like, I think for a lot of people, they're like, it's that throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which actually leads to the next question. That was like a 4-pronged question. I realized as I was writing, I was like, this is an intense thing. But, a lot of horror has been and continues to be about the destruction and of the lives and bodies of people with disenfranchised and marginalized identities. And so a lot of people are just like, well, let's just throw it out, right, and get rid of it. But I think all three of us agree that that is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so this leads to like a series of sub questions that you can tackle however you want, but just like, why horror, and what is it about horror that appeals to you, that makes you passionate enough to write about it again and again? And maybe tied into that is the question of like, what should horror be, or what can it be that affects the way that you think and write about the genre?
I know horror was one of those genres that I always grew up with. So my parents actually like got me into horror movies, between them not really restricting per se what we watched, but just the fact it was very accessible back then, like accessible, but also if you really wanted to see some things, you had to seek it out, right? So you had to go to your Blockbuster, you had to go to your rent-a-video stores, you had to go to the library and do your legwork to try and find it. Or let's say if it came on TV, you had to get to the TV guide, keep flipping, until you could find it, or you had to stay on top of your your Monster Vision when it came on TNT, or like your Turner Classic Movies Halloween month. And, we had so much really great stuff depending on when you were born. And, but horror was one of the first genres that I really got into because I saw how much love was poured into the storytelling, the special effects, the makeup, like that was actually one of my first like loves that really just like cemented for me that like horror is kind of this space that will never run out of steam or ideas, because there will always be creative people, artistic people, people who love costuming, just like the art of kind of exploring the unexplored. So like special effects and makeup and everything else was like one of my very like first like loves in the genre. So obviously, you know, your Universal horror films, what they were able to do, like it just still kind of blows my mind watching or rewatching and rewatching and rewatching. Quote unquote, some of the classics or some of the, you know, the black and whites, or and just seeing what they were, you know, kind of what they were capable of. It's just still like, well, if they had those same thoughts back then obviously it just makes me think of maybe just thinking about horror as like this long kind of space-time continuum that people have always been writing about, you know, horror, people have always been thinking about it. It's just only like within obviously the past couple hundred years that we're able to like film, you know, or in celluloid format, like document, you know, what people are trying to express, or I don't know, kind of delve into in a visual format as far as horror, because obviously before we had, you know, radio dramas, you know, or we had, you know, books like the Penny Dreadfuls and, you know, Gothic literature and so on and so forth. So horror is just, I don't know, it's just one of those genres that's just so good. It's just so good. Like I can't say that enough. Like for people who are kind of casual watchers, I think it would be great to really get more people into. And what's really great is in the past couple of decades, you all will probably agree with me that horror has like exploded as far as like popularity and inclusivity, and like the genre's just opening up more and more and more. And it's just been really beautiful to see. So not just like horror movies, but like horror video games, and like, yeah, it's just really cool to see, you know, so many things that for us once upon a time were very niche, very nerdy, very out there, quote unquote weird. Like now it's just like, I don't know, ordinary. It's not extraordinary anymore. It's very just like, oh, okay, horror, cool.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think how quickly that's changed, because and is still changing, because like we were talking about recently on the podcast, all of the controversy around the Scream films, which were coming out in the 90s and early 2000s. And there were cases in which they were like, you guys are actively responsible for creating a bad sense within the community, riling up these horrors. You're doing this. But I feel like maybe those conversations are slightly shifting. Do you see that as well, or is something else happening within the horror genre and conversation and the way we talk about horror?
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Toni. Like it's constantly shifting, because more and more space is not only just being allotted. I'm not even going to just talk about it as an allotment, but people are, just through the advent of social media more than ever before, people who at one time the door was closed on what they had to say, now like that door is being like kicked open. And it's really awesome to see people who, you know, once upon a time, like you said, like had no voice or had no say about even just crafting, let's say like women characters, right? Or the problematic elements of, you know, some of the slashers that are like super hyper masculine and violent, or even just exploring like sometimes the necessity, or even people who want to make that kind of stuff because it's excising like some demons, you know, for that writer or that director, or you know, it's just really interesting. Like, as you said, Toni, like it's still, we have to admit, yeah, like it's still being gate kept in some ways, but like there's no filter anymore. Like there's no, I don't know. It seems like now everybody's able to like drag a seat up to the table, like where before there's, you know, it was just like, well, sorry, no more seats. And you're like, no, I'm bringing a chair. Or I'm just gonna stand here until you pay attention to me or to us, you know.
Yeah, I can like actually picture in my mind that they're like, sorry, there's no more chairs, and then someone like has one of those chairs that unfolds, and they're like, don't worry, I brought my own.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Because that's, I mean, a lot of like the self-publishing, where a lot of really interesting horror is coming from, and a lot of the stuff that people are doing they're putting out there through Kindle Unlimited and some of those options, you know, I mean, it's bringing people to the table that wouldn't ever get to have their voice be heard before.
And social media also is just allowing, I mean, you talked about it specifically within your own career, was able to help amplify your voice to a larger thing. And I know the same thing's happening on like other platform like TikTok, and just talking about different types of horror than maybe we used to focus on exclusively before.
Absolutely.
Well, we had one question that was in between that I think you've answered, which is the theoretical and critical examinations. So I think we just like, what's next from the one and only Dani? Like, what should people be keeping their eyes on? Maybe you'd be willing, I don't know how much you can talk about the mental health and horror documentary. I'd love to know a little bit more about that. If you can talk about it, I know lots of projects are at various stages of openness.
Yeah. So I can't talk about it yet because I've still yet to film. There are a lot of interviews, and they really want to make sure that they get everything really clean, very tight. Like they want to make sure that people have plenty of time to say what they want to say. So actually, I will be recording that this month. I will be recording my segment for, or I don't know how they're gonna. I know obviously a documentary, it's gonna be kind of chopped up, and I'll be here, there, and a little everywhere throughout. So I'm just kind of excited to see how it's all going to come together. But just seeing that in our lifetime, like you mentioned, the fact that a mental health and horror documentary is even happening, like mental health has been just this kind of inextricable part of the genre itself. Like I mentioned, like horror is the space where, I think, where obviously the mainstream kind of gets horror wrong is that there are people who are making some absolutely beautiful and brilliant, social commentary, political stuff, completely like just smashing, a lot of like gender norms, are really kind of unpacking a lot of societal stuff that, is still like a day late and like a dollar short in so many different ways. That the horror space is constantly just like welcoming so many people like in, that it's always been this way, but a lot of people just didn't know or weren't aware. And I'm glad that more projects like this are coming out like all the time, or people are expressing it more and more. And even with the gosh, I hate to say this, everybody's always just like, they'll say the E word, the quote unquote elevated horror films, aka the ones that, get the prestige and certain lofty awards and stuff. Like people who make a lot of these movies, they don't do it for the awards. They do it for the community, or sometimes they even do it for themselves / the community, right? Like sometimes like these projects are like a labor of love, like intense like love, or an opportunity to, excise some demons or some, painful things in their past, or things like that. But you mentioned what's next. So this year, this is obviously Women's History Month. So I'm gonna try and see what I will come up with regarding two of my faves in women's horror history, Ellen Ripley and Sarah Connor. So I did write one piece like when the quote unquote door closed on the Terminator franchise, but like they were two of my absolute favorites who like in a sense I don't know, people who grew up with seeing these characters will probably get what I mean, but like it felt like they helped raise me in a lot of ways. They gave me different perspectives on like the world, on survival, on like being strong and what kind of strength that there can be, what kind of like empathy there can be, of mental health. You know, speaking of mental health, like they were two of like some of the first characters that I saw like go through it as far as like in their films and like in some really interesting ways. And you know, it was just like, so I can't wait to try and see if I can delve into that.
That'll be so neat.
I plan on this. I'm sorry, Toni, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm very excited to read that piece when it comes out later this month.
Later this year, I'm probably going to tackle some more video game pieces. It's been a while since, I think the very last video game piece I did was for Uppercut Crit last year about The Last of Us Part 2. And the the way the narrative really did not treat Black characters with care, like at all. And I finally kind of picked up on where the games always seemed to fall short for me, or something that was missing, or what is also making me really nervous about this Last of Us series that's coming to HBO. I'm like, I've tried to like tune out every single thing like I've heard about production or what's happening or the story, because it's like, I don't know, maybe I've attached a little bit of trauma to it, maybe a little bit. I don't know. I'm just really nervous because I'm like, I'm probably not going to watch it because I know that like, that I don't think Black people are going to survive in it. And I've seen that already. I've seen it in the video games. I don't think I need to watch that again. So, but the video games that I plan on probably delving into, speaking of Alien, Alien Isolation, Soma, We Happy Few, and like maybe that Alien Isolation piece, I think I was going to juxtapose maybe with like BioShock, like Infinite or something.
That makes sense.
I think that's going to be interesting. The juxtaposition of the setting of both games, like one being, or both of them being a future, right? One a lofty future, like in the stars, another one like being a lofty future, like in the clouds, and then like Soma being like a not so lofty future, like at the bottom of the ocean. But obviously the darkness, if you all have played these games or heard anything about them, is that there's a very dark, horrific component to every story that, you know, obviously is like glittering and pretty on the surface, but like once you start playing that game, you're just like, oh, okay, so no, this is not BioShock, great example. I've got some more horror movies to catch up on, so I'll see if something really, really intrigues me out of those. I don't know, I've just got a lot like on my plate. So
I mean, the good news is there's not a short amount or small amount of things for you to look at. It's not like you're gonna run out of materials. It's just more like time and, you know, how fast can your fingers move across the keyboard.
Totally. It's an out-of-body experience. I don't know if I think I've written about that before, but I don't know, like talking Dani mode is like kind of completely different than like writing Dani mode. Like you get in a completely different kind of headspace. People who write a lot know what I'm talking about.
There's a scholar whose name is Csikszentmihalyi, which I can never spell correctly, but it's just more consonants and not vowels than you think a name should have. But he talks about this idea of flow, right? And he said, and that's what it is, right? That moment where you realize that like you don't even remember typing anymore. You've kind of lost track of whether or not your body is hot or cold. And he has suggested very emphatically that that is what separates people who are happy from those who aren't, right? That it's not past a certain threshold IQ or money, that it is the more you engage with flow. And every time I read that, I'm just reminded of how true it is, right? Because there's something like magical about that moment of writing and all of it, right? The figuring out the words, editing the words. There's just something really, it's flow, right? It's outstanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dani. To those of you listening, you can read Dani's full like list of accomplishments and excitements, as well as how to get a hold of Dani on social media. You can read that in the description below, and you should. I follow you, and it's like it's very encouraging, sometimes discouraging, because you're like, I have another piece, and I'm like, I stared at a wall today, but it always means that like, but I feel like every time, it reminds me that I can like have pockets. Like I don't have to like have some huge intense project. I can have these moments of depth, which is one of the reasons I like talking with Toni. But thank you so much, Dani. To the listeners, thank you for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.